My name is Carl Mosier. I'm a biblical scholar and theologian living in Southern California. So I'm the husband of one wife and father of 6 children as well. Well, the first thing I want to say is satisfaction is a concept, but we don't want to say it's a concept of atonement as such. It's a concept that is used in a great deal of Western theology from the patristic era onwards for articulating the work of Christ. But it's a concept that really comes from everyday life. So satisfaction has to do with, the term itself means to do enough. Satis is enough, facere, to do. And it is to do enough to fulfill an obligation, to pay a debt, to make reparation for wrongdoing. So it's a fairly broad and flexible concept as such. It gets used in Christian theology, beginning with some of the church fathers. Tertullian famously uses the Latin term satisfacere. Concept, though not necessarily the term, shows up in some of the Greek fathers like Athanasius, who understand the suffering and death of Jesus to, amongst other things, have paid a debt, to have compensated for humanity's wrongdoing. Of course, most famously, Anselm makes a lot of the concept of satisfaction in his Cur Deus Homo. And there's a lot of misconceptions here, though, with regard to Anselm. It's often said, well, he's just taking up a notion from Roman law, or this is a medieval feudal notion. And I think it's important to really emphasize the point that satisfaction is a rather mundane phenomenon within human societies. We can see that even in our interpersonal relationships with one another. So let's say that you've done something that offends your wife. And perhaps you've not done something she wanted you to do. So we can think in terms of a sin of commission and a sin of omission. So Matt's wife wanted him to do a certain thing, right? There's an obligation there. And satisfaction takes place when Matt does enough that she is content that he has fulfilled the obligation. On the other hand, if he has offended her, he needs to do something to make up for that. It might be a simple apology, or if it's a more serious offense, you might combine that with perhaps a small gift. And in a case where perhaps there has been both sin of omission and commission, she wanted you to do X. Instead, you did Y, and she doesn't like you doing Y. You may need to do both aspects here, and you do that thing in a way that will please her. And then you promise her that you will not do this other thing that displeases her. And then you offer a gift as a kind of reparation or compensation for your wrongdoing. And in the process, you please her because on the one hand, the obligation you had has been fulfilled. And then on the other, there's been an act of contrition and reparation to make up for the thing that you should not have done, right? So you have 2 senses of satisfaction at play. Now, in medieval theology, and in early modern theology that we find in the reformers and the early scholastics, we find that both senses of satisfaction play a very important role in explaining the work of Christ. And we see this in all the major confessions, Augsburg, Westminster, Heidelberg Catechism, many others, so the French Confession, that the work of Christ is understood as an act of satisfaction that the Son of God in our humanity offers to the Father, and which the Father accepts and applies to all who are joined to Christ, all who are in union with Christ. And that this counts as compensation or reparation for our sin, both our original sin, beginning with Adam, and our actual post-baptismal sin. And that it also is something that Jesus does that goes above and beyond what was necessary. He offers his obedient life as a gift to the Father, obeying, as Paul says in Philippians 2, to the point of death, even death on a cross. Or as Paul says in Romans 5, right, this one act of righteousness is an obedience that counters the disobedience of Adam. So we have satisfaction of humanity's obligations to obey God, to love God with all our heart, mind, strength, etc. But we also have satisfaction of the debt incurred by sin, right? Sin incurs a kind of moral debt. And Christ offers his obedient life, culminating in suffering and death, as a compensation for our wrongdoing. And the Father values the obedience of Christ more than he disvalues our disobedience, right? That Christ's obedience and the merit of his suffering and death outweighs by far all of humanity's sin. And the result is propitiation. All right. And propitiation is a word, like satisfaction, that's often misunderstood today. But propitiation is to make somebody pleased. It is to appease, if they're angry, to appease their anger, to quench it, to extinguish it. It is to render somebody well disposed. And the idea in the classic Protestant doctrine is that Christ made satisfaction for humanity's sin. Christ satisfied the demands of God's law, both the positive precepts as well as the penalty which he did not owe, which was suffering and death. And by making satisfaction in these ways, he so pleases the Father that the wrath to come that we deserved as children of wrath, as Paul puts it in Ephesians, is simply extinguished. So once the cause of offense has been taken care of, the sin that provoked his wrath, once that is expiated by the satisfaction of Christ, then the wrath of God is simply dissipated against that sin. And so the confessional doctrine places a lot of importance on Christ making satisfaction for sin. And in part it does so because this is some debates about satisfaction were actually quite central to the Reformation itself and the differences between Catholics and Protestants. So it becomes a very important doctrine within Lutheran, Reformed, and Anglican confessional theology. So that's a very long answer to your short question. The concept is at work in the biblical texts. In early Old Testament texts, we have sin often depicted as a weight or a burden that one carries. But then there seems to be a shift that takes place so that sin becomes conceived of in terms of a debt that needs to be paid, a kind of moral debt. And how do you pay a debt? Well, that's an aspect of the classic notion of satisfaction. It is to do enough to meet that obligation you have, a traffic violation or something, right? You have a debt that needs to be paid, you have an obligation, and you satisfy it by simply paying what is owed. In a number of texts in the prophets, we have sin conceived as a debt that Israel needed to satisfy, The notion of sin as a debt carries on into the New Testament, and perhaps most famously in the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And we see satisfaction depicted in Colossians when the Apostle Paul talks about Christ on the cross, and he mentions the principalities and powers. So you get the Christus Victor elements there. But we also have Paul mentioning this handwritten document, this statement that gets nailed to the cross. And Anderson and others have pointed out that seems to be a document of indebtedness or debt slavery being nailed there as saying that it has now been canceled, or that the terms have been satisfied, so that it is no longer binding. There is no longer any force. And I think one could argue that the concept of satisfaction is a deeply biblical one. And we could point to other passages as well. Historically, Romans 3:25 and 26, which speaks of Christ being set forth as a hilasterion, right? Perhaps a gift of propitiation. There's a lot of debate on how to translate hilasterion. And that in doing so, God exhibits his righteousness, his dikaiosune, or his justice, and is thus both just and justifier. God is just because he justifies. Classically, early modern Protestant theology understood Romans 3:25 and 26 as a satisfaction text, and that God is just in how he justifies because Christ made satisfaction for humanity's sin. And in making satisfaction was our propitiation before God.